Welcome to the Global Investor Podcast, a show that focuses on helping foreign investors enter the lucrative U.S. real estate market. Host Charles Carillo combines decades of real estate investing experience with a professional background in international banking to interview experts in all areas of U.S. real estate investing. Now, here's your host, Charles Carillo.
Welcome to another episode of the Global Investors Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Carillo. Today we have Jilliene Helman. She is the founder and CEO of RealtyMogul, an online marketplace for investors to invest in institutional quality real estate. To date, investors have invested over $750 million in over $4.1 billion worth of real estate on RealtyMogul's platform. So thank you so much for being on the show, Jilliene.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So you have a little different of a background and of a business of most of our guests, but please give us a little bit about your background, both personally and professionally, prior to founding RealtyMogul.
Sure. I grew up in a really entrepreneurial family on the personal side. So we talked about, business at the dinner table. I joke that I was in business conversations from, 2 or 3 years old when I started being able to, talk. And I ended up going to business school at Georgetown out in DC. And then coming out of there, I went to work for a bank, actually a Japanese bank, Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, which was headquartered in Tokyo and then had operations here in the US through a couple of banks that they'd acquired. And one of the areas that I worked at the bank was in wealth management. And one of the themes that we saw being in wealth management was that our wealthiest clients were real estate investors. So in addition to growing up in an entrepreneurial family, I also grew up in a family that had a lot of experience and interest in real estate. So if my grandfather had built an apartment building in Los Angeles, my mother was in the luxury residential markets, and my father owned commercial and office, really industrial. They had warehouses where he was importing goods from China and other countries. And so kind of grew up in a real estate family, grew up in a very entrepreneurial family. Coming out of wealth management, I saw that our wealthiest investors and our wealthiest clients were real estate investors. So really wanted to pair sort of this love of real estate with this love of helping people to meet their dreams and sort of accomplish their goals in life. And that's really the inception story behind RealtyMogul and sort of how I got here from kind of the intersection of my personal life and the intersection of my professional life. I was the dorky, geeky kid who loved Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and that's what you'd find me, reading in bed at 9, 10, 11 years old. So I've always been interested in how you invest and what the best investments are and how to go about sort of crafting a portfolio to help secure one's financial future.
Interesting. So can you explain a little bit about crowdfunding, just in kind of an over basis of what it is and how it evolved since the Jobs Act, I believe it was, that really opened the door for it?
Sure. So crowdfunding is just a fancy word for syndication, right? Pooling capital together. This happens to be on the internet. The old syndication was typically at the country club or sort of pass the hat, right? Where you had investors who were putting in $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 a pop to be able to pool that capital together and invest in a real estate deal. That's exactly what crowdfunding is. It's just a fancier name for syndication. The inception of sort of digital syndication came about through a piece of legislation called the Jobs Act. It was passed back in 2012. And it essentially was the first time that the securities laws were changed since the Securities Act of 1933, 1934. So it'd been a very, very long time since there was an adaptation in the securities laws to really account for the internet, right? And it's sort of hard to believe, the internet's now been around for a couple of decades, and yet the securities laws just hadn't been adjusted to account for it. And so the most critical piece of that, for us at least, was the ability to publicly market private transactions. So historically, it was illegal to publicly market a private transaction. And through a new rule called 506C, it was now legal to publicly market private transactions so long as you jump through a couple of extra hoops and hurdles on the legal side, which we've built a lot of automation around in our business. And namely, that is doing some type of validation for an investor being an accredited investor. So in the US today, private investments are still limited to accredited investors. That's typically an investor with a net worth over $1 million, excluding their primary home, or an annual income above $200,000. And in the old world, you didn't have to validate that. So an investor could raise their hand and say, I'm an accredited investor, and you could, trust them. In the new world, you have to have some type of validation. So that is either a letter from a CPA, a letter from a licensed attorney, or you can get their tax returns and actually sort of do that math and do that calculation on your own. And that was the biggest piece of the Jobs Act, I would say, that's impacted our business. In addition, another piece of the Jobs Act was a new regulation called Reg A Plus, And that allowed you to actually build a public company under a regulation called Reg A Plus, which is a federal exemption. So historically, if you wanted to have a non-traded public company, meaning a company that's not traded on a NASDAQ or a New York Stock Exchange, you would have to go state by state by state and get approvals from each of those states to sell securities in those states. So I'd have to go to Alaska and Arizona and California, et cetera, et cetera. Under Reg A Plus, it's a federal exemption. So you can just do a notice filing to those states. You don't actually have to get explicit approval from each state. Obviously, you have to follow their laws and you have to be a good actor, and all of those things are true. But those were the two big changes in the Jobs Act that impact our business today. We've got two real estate investment trusts or REITs that are offered under Reg A Plus. And then in addition, we do a lot of transactions for accredited investors under Reg D 506C, where those accredited investors are then validating their accreditation through one of those third-party validation tools.
So RealtyMogul, as I understand, is pretty much like a marketplace where as a sponsor, you can put deals, and as an investor, I can find deals. Can you give me a little bit more in depth of what you provide to both sponsors and investors that want to utilize your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So two-sided marketplace, as you mentioned, we've got investors on one side and we've got real estate companies on the other side. And those real estate companies might be called sponsors, they might be called developers. That's all sort of synonymous for a real estate company. So on the investor side of the platform, we strongly believe in empowering our investors. And what that means is giving them choice. Right. And so we provide them with a lot of different choices that they can invest in. The first choice is, do you want to invest in a single transaction? So do you want to invest in, a specific apartment building, a specific shopping center, a specific office building, a specific self-storage facility, as an example? Or do you want to invest into a diversified pool of properties where you're making one investment and then there's a diversified pool of, different properties or different geographies? So that's kind of the first choice. The second choice is, what type of property do you want to invest in? We have some investors who will come to the platform and say, I only want to invest in apartment buildings. We have other investors who will come to the platform and they'll say, I want to get diversification. I want to be in office, I want to be in apartments, I want to be in retail. And then there's geography, right? What geography do you want to invest in? Some investors want to invest in their own backyard. So they live and work in Columbus, Ohio, and they'll invest in a deal on the platform in Columbus, Ohio. Other folks maybe want to get broader diversification. So they live in New York City and they want to invest in the Sun Belt in, Atlanta, or they want to invest in Florida and Tampa or Miami or wherever it may be. So on the investor side, it's really about empowering them, giving them a lot of choice, but also doing a first level of curation. So we will do each investment on the RealtyMogul platform meets our minimum due diligence standards and our minimum requirements, because we don't want investors to be seeing the entire universe of real estate transactions, good, bad, or ugly, right? And we see a lot of stuff that it doesn't make sense, right? Either the sponsor's not qualified, or the real estate doesn't make sense, or one of the assumptions doesn't make sense. So we'll do sort of that first level of due diligence or that first level of curation for the platform, but then it's really up to the investor to come to the platform and dig in, right? And we provide a lot of information through the website where they can dig in and make a really informed decision for themselves, because investing is very personal. One investor may have totally different goals than another investor. And so that's where we go back to empower the investor, give them a lot of choice. On the other side of the marketplace, for real estate companies, for sponsors, for developers, we're giving them access to all of these investors. So, raising equity capital is very, very challenging. And it's a sort of an oxymoron, because to grow as a real estate company, you have to be good at it, but that's actually not the same skill set as being good at operating and running real estate, right? So raising capital tends to be more of a sales activity, and owning and operate real estate tends to be more of an introverted, details-oriented kind of skill set, right? And so we're trying to bridge that gap where these real estate companies can get access to a wide variety of investors. They can do one webinar and they can get that message out broadly across, the database of investors who are signed up for RealtyMogul. And we also really want to streamline the process for those real estate investors. So one of the things that we do that's a little bit different is we stay on for the life of the transaction as an administrative services company. And what that means is that on behalf of that real estate company, we're issuing the distributions, we're distributing the K-1s, we're syndicating all of the reporting, and the investors are coming to us after those transactions close to ask different questions. Now, many times we'll know the answer to the question just because we've got, a deep bench of real estate expertise, but sometimes we won't. And then we'll aggregate those and we'll go to the sponsor, with an aggregated list of questions that we need the answer to in order to share those back with investors after the transaction's closed. So that's a really big benefit to those real estate companies who may not have the infrastructure to manage, hundreds of individual investors.
Interesting. So what is RealtyMogul looking for in a sponsor? I imagine it's pretty straightforward. If I'm an investor, I come to your platform, I'm accredited, I can tell you what I'm looking for and I find it. As a sponsor, I imagine you're a little bit more discerning on who's allowed on the platform. So what do you look for in a sponsor? And then possibly what are you looking for in the deal after you've okayed or vetted the sponsor?
Yeah. So look, in the sponsor, we're looking for professionals, right? These are not folks who do real estate on the side. This is their full-time profession. They're running a company that does this. We're looking for sponsors that have a track record. We're looking for sponsors that have, a deep resume of being in commercial real estate. And we're looking for sponsors who I would say have some level of customization. So what I mean by that is, if they're apartment investors and they bring a deal to the platform that's a retail deal in Florida and all of their investments have been apartments in Atlanta, it's not going to be something that we're interested in, right? So we're looking for folks who are really specialists either in the type of apartment or in the geography that they're going after. I don't have a problem if someone owns office, retail, and industrial, and all of that is in Tampa, right? Like they know that market very well. I'm okay if they cross asset classes, but typically we're looking for someone who's got sort of that specialty or that expertise. When we dig into the deal, we're looking at a lot of things, and it depends kind of on the property type. If it's multifamily, we're looking for certain things. If it's retail, as an example, we're looking for certain things. But I'd say more generally, we're looking for a business plan that we think is executable and that we think makes sense. Right. And so when I say, and there's always risk, right? There's risk in any execution of any real estate business plan. But I'll give you an example. If we see a deal where it's a multifamily deal and the real estate company wants to spend, $1,000 a unit and thinks that rents are going to go up $500 a unit, we know from experience that's probably not going to happen. Now, if they want to go spend $30,000 a unit or $40,000 a unit, and then they think that they can push rents $500 a unit and there's rental comps to support that, that business plan might make sense. Right. And so we're really looking for those business plans. We're looking at location. One of the things that makes us a bit different is that we have someone from our company go step foot on the real estate. Okay. So we want to make sure that property actually exists. We want to understand the neighborhood. We want to understand what else is around it. So those are the types of things that we're looking at sort of the real estate level after we've done a lot of research on the real estate company to make sure that they meet our minimum requirements.
For a sponsor, say that are aspiring and they want to get future projects onto RealtyMogul, you've gone through a lot of it, specialize in what you're doing, go full cycle, I imagine, on certain deals so they can show it to you. Is there anything else that you would suggest to aspiring syndicators that want to get put on RealtyMogul or other crowdfunding platforms that would help them to be allowed to do that?
Look, at the end of the day, you got to get deals done, right? And you got to be good at your craft. That's the most important. Beyond that, I would say, have a great reputation, which is, caused by the former around, being good at your craft. But I think another one is be very professional, be very timely. If there's a question that comes over, get that response out quickly. You're working with people, right? And in a lot of these deals, we're signing up for 5, 7, 10 years that we're going to be in business with these real estate companies. And so if we're having problems getting timely responses, initially, like that's not going to be good for anybody, and that's going to harm their reputation. The other thing I would say is have very professional materials. So sometimes sponsors will send us, a one-page slick that is not detailed, is not well formatted, doesn't look nice, and those things matter. That detail orientation matter, because if you can't put the time, energy, and effort into your materials, how do we know that you're going to put the time, energy, and effort into, unit renovation? And that you're going to care about, the color scheme and the hardware, and that, the unit looks nice. And that's what's going to, drive rental rates up. So that attention to detail, that attention to design, I think is important. But really at the end of the day, it's, you have to get deals done, and you have to build a track record, I think, to be able to use a crowdfunding platform.
So for passive investors getting onto RealtyMogul, and you do a lot of vetting on the sponsors, on the deals, you have someone that steps physically onto the property, which is awesome. I wasn't aware of that. What type of due diligence do you recommend to investors to perform on deals prior to them investing? Is there something that you suggest them to do, or some sort of, anything like that?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think, is getting a really clear understanding of where an investor sits on the risk and reward curve. And what's appropriate for their own personal financial situation. So like putting the deal aside, it's more, there are certain investors who should not be investing in development, right? If you're looking for current income, if you don't have a long time horizon, like development is just a bad idea, right? There's other investors who want to take, aggressive risk and they've got a really long timeline and they don't need the income. Well, development might be a perfectly acceptable, risk reward equation.
Yeah.
So I think the first step is really figuring out, for you as an individual investor, like what makes sense for your own personal financial situation. And then from there, it's dig into the details, right? I talked about real estate companies being detail oriented. I think that it's in investors' best interest to be detail oriented as well and ask a lot of questions. We require that the real estate companies do a webinar on our platform so that investors can ask questions, right? And if there's something you don't understand, ask a question. If there's an assumption that you don't think makes sense, ask the question, right? We get a lot of questions around, you're acquiring the property at a 4 cap, you're exiting at a 5 cap, why do you think that that's appropriate, right? As an example of just something that might come up. Or if you don't understand what a waterfall is, ask what a waterfall is, ask what the difference is between the gross returns and the net returns, make sure you understand the fees and the compensation of that real estate company. And also, ask questions about the market or the location. I mean, we've done transactions where we think the business plan makes sense, but they might be in high crime areas. Right. That's going to create added risk. That's going to create added execution risk. So, ask questions about that. Make sure you're comfortable with that. I think it's look for the problems in the deal, right? It's very easy to convince ourselves that deals are great, right? And so I'd say to investors, have a more skeptical outlook, look for the problems in the transaction. And sometimes you're going to overcome them and you're going to get comfortable with, the mitigants to those risks. And other times you're not. And you're going to say, this just isn't a deal that's a fit for me. And I'd rather take a lower return and invest in something that's a little bit more core, has a little bit less risk. But I think that, being detail oriented, digging in deep, and asking a lot of questions.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned too is on the time horizon. That's a big thing for investors because they might say, well, the last sponsor did the deal in 3 years. Well, really, this is 5 to 7 years that you have to be ready for. It's not something where you can just bank off if they did this last deal and execute the business plan in 36 months because the market could change and you have to be aware of that. You know what I mean? So that's one big thing that I've seen when speaking to our investors and potential investors. About half of our listeners on the show are foreign investors. So does RealtyMogul allow foreign investors into their platform?
Yeah, we do, although they come in through a U.S. entity. So what'll typically happen is that they'll create a U.S. entity, they'll get a, typically an LLC, they'll get a, U.S. tax ID number and they'll invest through that U.S. entity. So we've got a number of foreign investors who have done that. We don't do tax withholding on behalf of foreign investors. So, they need to come in through that U.S. entity, with a U.S. tax ID number.
Okay. And as we're wrapping up here, what do you think are some of the main factors that have contributed to your success, Jilliene?
Putting one foot in front of the other every single day. There's no secret, there's no shortcut. You just show up every day and you give 100% of what you can give that day. One of my favorite quotes is opportunity dances with those on the dance floor. And you have to show up, right? Like if you don't show up, how are you going to get lucky? If you don't show up, how is that opportunity, going to arise? I think too, just being prepared, right? Fortune, I think benefits the prepared and allows you to have opportunities and seize those opportunities if you're prepared and if you're ready. But there's no secret. Just show up every day, put in 100% of what you can give, that day, and that's good enough. And show up the next day and do it again.
Yeah, that's what I used to say. Showing up's half the battle. How can our listeners learn more about you and your business?
So go to RealtyMogul.com. It's free to create a user account. You can start looking at deals. There's no obligation. So you can just start learning. We have a lot of investors who will come on our platform and learn and listen to the webinars. And I love that. I love being a platform where people can get educated. And if you want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn, Jilliene Helman, and feel free to ping me and let me know that you heard me on the podcast and be happy to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and looking forward to connecting with you in the near future.
Likewise. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Hi, guys. It's Charles from the Global Investors Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're interested in getting involved with real estate, but you don't know where to begin, set up a free 30-minute strategy call with me at schedulecharles.com. That's schedulecharles.com. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Global Investor Podcast. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Google Play to get new weekly episodes. For more resources and to receive our newsletter, please visit globalinvestorpodcast.com. And don't forget to join us next week for another episode.
Nothing in this episode should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Any investment opportunities mentioned on this podcast are limited to accredited investors. Any investments will only be made with proper disclosure, subscription documentation, and are subject to all applicable laws. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Syndication Superstars LLC exclusively.